Have you ever noticed how some people respond when something costs too much? They immediately say, I can't afford that. End of discussion, door closed, conversation over. But then there are wealthy people, millionaires. And here's something weird. You'll almost never hear them say those exact words. Not because they can afford everything. That's not it at all. It's because they ask a completely different question. A question that changes everything. Here's what nobody tells you. The phrase, I can't afford that, isn't really about money. It's about mindset. It's about how you think, how you solve problems, how you approach life. And here at Simple Money, we've spent years studying how wealthy people think differently about money, not just what they do, but how their brains actually work when they encounter something they want. Today, I'm going to reveal the exact mental framework that separates people who build wealth from people who stay broke. And I promise you, it's not what you think. By the end of this, you'll understand why I can't afford that is one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language, and what successful people say instead. Let me show you what I mean with a real scenario. Two people are walking through a store. They both see the same thing, a high-quality laptop, $1,500. Person one looks at the price tag, immediately thinks, I can't afford that, walks away, done. The thought process is over in 3 seconds. Person two looks at the same price tag, but here's what goes through their mind instead. How could I afford that? What would I need to do? Is there a way to make this work? See the difference? It's not that person two has more money. They might have the exact same bank account, the exact same income, the exact same financial situation. But their brain does something completely different when it encounters an obstacle. Person one hits a wall and stops. Person two hits a wall and starts problem solving. And here's what makes this so important. This isn't just about buying stuff. This is about how you approach everything in life. When you say, I can't afford that, you're training your brain to stop thinking, to accept limitations, to shut down creativity. It becomes a habit, a reflex, an automatic response to any challenge. Can't afford the course that would teach you new skills. Can't afford to start that business. Can't afford to invest. Can't afford to take the risk that might change your life. Meanwhile, wealthy people train their brains to do the opposite, to stay open, to find solutions, to see possibilities where others see dead ends. And over time, over years and decades, this difference in thinking creates completely different lives. One person is stuck, frustrated, always feeling limited by money. The other person is building, growing, creating opportunities that didn't exist before. Same starting point, different question, entirely different destination. The first thing you need to understand is what I call the question gap. Here's how it works. Poor people ask themselves, can I afford this? It's a yes or no question, binary. Simple, and it usually ends with no. Wealthy people ask themselves, how can I afford this? It's an open-ended question. It requires creativity, problem solving, strategy. This might seem like a small difference, just a few words, but those few words change everything. Let me show you why this matters. When you ask, can I afford this? You're checking your current resources, your bank account right now, your paycheck this month, your available credit. If the money isn't there, the answer is no. End of story. But when you ask, how can I afford this? Your brain goes to work. It starts generating options, possibilities, strategies. Maybe you could earn extra money. Maybe you could save up over time. Maybe you could trade something. Maybe you could find a cheaper alternative that gets you 90% there. Maybe you could partner with someone. Maybe you could learn to make it yourself. Suddenly, instead of one answer, you have 10 potential paths. Think about it this way. Imagine your brain is a search engine. When you ask a yes or no question, it returns one result, yes or no. But when you ask an open question, starting with how, it returns hundreds of results, options, ideas, solutions. Wealthy people aren't smarter. They're not luckier. They just ask better questions. And over time, asking better questions leads to finding better answers, which leads to taking better actions, which leads to getting better results. The question gap isn't about positive thinking. It's not about manifesting or visualization or any of that stuff. It's about training your brain to be a problem solver instead of a problem acceptor. The second pattern is what I call the scarcity shutdown. This one is particularly destructive because it feels protective. Here's what happens. When you say, I can't afford that, your brain goes into scarcity mode. It sees a threat, a limitation, a lack, and when your brain perceives scarcity, it shuts down your creative thinking. This is actual neuroscience. When you feel threatened or limited, your brain prioritizes survival. It stops looking for opportunities. It stops being creative. It just focuses on protecting what you have. You become defensive, conservative, risk averse, which makes perfect sense if you're being chased by a lion, but terrible if you're trying to build wealth. Because building wealth requires the opposite. It requires seeing opportunities, taking calculated risks, thinking creatively, trying new things. Now, here's what wealthy people do differently. Instead of triggering scarcity mode, they trigger abundance mode. Even when they don't have the money right now, they say, I don't have the money for this yet, but how could I get it? That yet and that how keep their brain in possibility mode. In problem-solving mode, in growth mode, their brain stays open, creative, looking for solutions. Let me give you a concrete example. Two people want to start a business. Both need $10,000 for initial expenses. Neither one has it. Person A says, I can't afford to start a business. Their brain shuts down. They go back to their job. They stop thinking about it. Person B says, I don't have $10,000 yet. How could I get it? Their brain starts working. Could I save $2,000 over 5 months? Could I find a partner to split costs? Could I start smaller with $2,000? Could I pre-sell to customers? Could I get a small business loan? Could I offer my service first and use profits to grow? See what happened? Same obstacle. But person B's brain generated 6 potential solutions in 30 seconds. That's the difference between scarcity shutdown and abundance thinking. And here's the really important part. You can train this. You can practice asking how instead of accepting can't. And the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. The third pattern is what I call the passive victim trap. This one is subtle but incredibly powerful. When you say, I can't afford that, you're positioning yourself as a victim, as someone things happen to, as someone without control or agency. The language matters. I can't means something external is preventing you. You're powerless. But wealthy people use different language. They say things like, I'm choosing not to buy this right now, or this isn't a priority for me, or I'm allocating my money elsewhere. Notice the difference? They're in control. They're making decisions. They're exercising choice. This isn't just semantics. This is about identity, about how you see yourself in the world. When you're a victim, you're reactive. Things happen and you respond. You're at the mercy of circumstances, of prices, of the economy, of your job, of luck. When you're in control, you're proactive. You make choices. You create circumstances. You strategize. You adapt. You find ways. Let me show you how this plays out in real life. Someone who says, I can't afford a house, is waiting for something to change, for prices to drop, for their salary to magically increase, for a windfall. They're passive, waiting, hoping. Someone who says, I haven't prioritized saving for a house yet, but here's my plan to make it happen, is active, planning, working toward a goal. They might not be able to afford the house today, but they've shifted from victim to creator, from passive to active, from can't to working on it. And here's the thing about being active versus passive. When you're active, you see opportunities. When you're passive, you miss them. Opportunities to increase income, to reduce expenses, to invest, to learn, to grow, to build. The passive victim trap doesn't just keep you broke, it keeps you stuck. Mentally, emotionally, practically. Breaking out of it isn't about having more money. It's about changing how you talk to yourself, how you frame challenges, how you see your role in your own financial story. The fourth pattern is what I call the value blindness. This one might be the most important, and almost nobody talks about it. Here's what happens when you say, I can't afford that. You're looking at the price, the cost, the amount of money leaving your bank account, but you're completely blind to the value, the benefit, the return on investment. Wealthy people don't just look at what things cost. They look at what things are worth, what they'll return, what they'll enable, what they'll create. Think about it this way. A $1,500 laptop, to person one, that's $1,500 gone. Money they don't have, an expense they can't justify. To person two, that's a tool. Could that laptop help them start a side business, learn a valuable skill, create something they could sell, work remotely, increase their productivity? If that laptop helps you earn an extra $500 a month, is it expensive? Or is it one of the best investments you could make? Same laptop, same price, completely different evaluation. This is value blindness, seeing only cost, never value. And it shows up everywhere, not just with purchases, with everything. Can't afford to take that course. But what if that course taught you skills worth an extra $20,000 a year for the rest of your career? Can't afford to hire help. But what if that help freed up 10 hours a week you could use to grow your business? Can't afford to invest. But what if those investments compound for 30 years? When you're blind to value, every purchase feels like a loss. Every dollar spent feels like money wasted. But when you see value clearly, you understand that some spending is actually investing. Some costs are actually leverage. Some money going out will bring back much more. Now, here's the critical nuance. This doesn't mean buy everything. It doesn't mean justify every purchase as an investment. Most things aren't investments. Most things are just consumption. But wealthy people can tell the difference. They evaluate value. They calculate return. They think strategically about what will pay off. Poor people see all spending the same way, as money leaving, as something to avoid, as something they can't afford. That's value blindness, and it keeps you stuck seeing everything as a cost instead of evaluating what's actually an investment in your future. The fifth and final pattern is what I call the learning block. This one is sneaky because it disguises itself as financial prudence. Here's how it works. When you say, I can't afford that, you stop thinking. The conversation ends. Your brain disengages. But wealthy people use financial challenges as learning opportunities. When they can't afford something, they ask questions. Why can't I afford this? What would need to be true for me to afford this? What's the gap between where I am and where I need to be? These questions lead to insight, to understanding, to growth. Let me give you an example. Someone looks at a nice car, $60,000, way outside their budget. Person A says, I can't afford that. Done. They move on. They learned nothing. Person B asks, why can't I afford this? Let's see. I make $50,000 a year. After taxes, that's about $40,000. After expenses, I save about $5,000 a year. So it would take me 12 years to save for this car. That's insane. Why do I only save $5,000 a year? Because my expenses eat everything. Why are my expenses so high? What could I change? Or how could I increase my income? Do you see what just happened? The car became a teacher. The limitation became a diagnostic tool. The gap revealed the problem. Person B just learned that their issue isn't the expensive car, it's their income to expense ratio. That's the real problem, and now they can work on fixing it. The learning block prevents this entire chain of thinking. It stops you at can't afford it. You never dig deeper, never understand the real issue, never learn what needs to change. Wealthy people treat every financial limitation as feedback, as information about their current financial system, as a clue about what needs to improve. They're constantly learning, constantly diagnosing, constantly optimizing. Meanwhile, people who stay broke just keep hitting the same walls over and over, never stopping to understand why the wall is there, never learning how to build a door. The learning block isn't just about buying things, it's about financial growth, about understanding your money, about identifying real problems versus symptoms, and breaking through it is as simple as getting curious instead of defeated, asking questions instead of accepting limitations, learning instead of just reacting. Now, let me dig into something that might make you uncomfortable. The phrase, "I can't afford that," is socially acceptable. It's even seen as responsible, mature, wise. People will nod approvingly when you say it. They'll think you're being financially prudent, living within your means, being realistic, and in some cases, they're right. If you're about to buy something stupid that you genuinely shouldn't buy, then yes, recognizing you can't afford it is good. But here's what nobody wants to admit. Most of the time, "I can't afford that" isn't wisdom. It's an excuse, a way to avoid the harder question, a way to stop thinking, a comfortable phrase that lets you off the hook. Because "how could I afford that" is uncomfortable. It requires effort. It demands creativity. It forces you to confront your current financial situation, your income, your expenses, your choices, your priorities. It's so much easier to just say, "I can't afford it," and move on. Think about the things you've said you can't afford in the last year. How many of them were things that could have genuinely changed your life, improved your skills, increased your income, created new opportunities? And how many of those did you dismiss with, "I can't afford it," without ever seriously exploring how you might make it work? I'm not saying you should have bought all of them. I'm saying you should have asked the question, because here's what I've discovered after watching hundreds of people build wealth. The ones who make it aren't necessarily smarter, they're not luckier, they don't have secret advantages. They just refuse to accept "I can't afford it" as the end of the conversation. They treat it as the beginning. They see financial limitations as puzzles to solve, as challenges to overcome, as gaps to bridge. And over time, over years of asking how instead of accepting can't, they build completely different lives. They develop skills, they create income streams, they spot opportunities, they take calculated risks, they invest, they grow, not because they started with more money, but because they started with better questions. Let me tell you about two people who wanted the same thing. First, there's David. David worked a regular job, made about $55,000 a year. He was interested in real estate investing, thought it could be a path to building wealth. He went to a real estate seminar. It cost $2,000. David looked at the price and thought, "I can't afford that." $2,000 was a lot of money. He had bills, he had expenses. He didn't have $2,000 just sitting around, so he didn't go. He bought a book instead, $10, much more reasonable. He read about 20 pages of the book, got busy, life happened, the book sat on his shelf. A few months later, David saw an online course about investing, $500. Again, "I can't afford that. Too expensive." A year later, he saw a rental property that would have been a great starter investment, needed $15,000 for a down payment. "I can't afford that. Way too much money." Fast forward 5 years, David still worked the same job, still made about the same money, still thought real estate would be great, still hadn't done anything about it. Every opportunity met the same response. "Can't afford it, too expensive, not in the budget." David wasn't irresponsible. He wasn't lazy. He was just stuck in a pattern, a mental loop he couldn't break out of. Now let me tell you about Lisa. Lisa had the same job, the same income, about $55,000 a year. She was also interested in real estate investing. She saw the same $2,000 seminar. Her first thought was also, I can't afford that. But then she caught herself. Changed the question. How could I afford that? What would it take? She did the math. If she cut back on eating out for 2 months and picked up some freelance work on weekends, she could save $2,000 in about 10 weeks. Was it easy? No. Did she have to make sacrifices? Yes. But she asked herself, is 2 months of sacrifice worth learning a skill that could change my financial life? She decided yes. She went to the seminar, took notes, got excited, but more importantly, she met people, networked, found a mentor. 6 months later, she found that rental property, the one that needed $15,000 down. Old Lisa would have said, I can't afford that. But new Lisa asked, how could I make this work? She talked to her mentor, learned about partnership deals, found someone with capital who wanted to invest but didn't have time. They partnered, split ownership. Lisa put in $3,000 and sweat equity. Her partner put in $12,000 and trusted her to manage it. The property cash flowed, generated positive income every month. A year later, they bought another property. Same structure. Fast forward 5 years, Lisa owned partial stakes in 4 rental properties. They generated about $18,000 a year in passive income. Plus, she'd learned so much that she quit her job and became a real estate agent. Now she made about $85,000 a year. Plus, the rental income, same starting point as David, same income, same interest, same opportunities, but completely different questions, completely different results, completely different life. Here's what most people don't realize about the difference between David and Lisa. It wasn't about money. They had the same amount of money. It wasn't about opportunity. They saw the same opportunities. It wasn't about talent or intelligence or connections. They were equally capable. The only difference was the question they asked themselves when they encountered something they wanted but didn't have money for. David asked, can I afford this? Checked his bank account. Said no, stopped thinking. Lisa asked, how could I afford this? Kept her brain engaged, found creative solutions, made things happen. One question closed doors, the other question opened them. And here's the part that might blow your mind. This difference compounds over time. Every time David said, I can't afford it, he reinforced the pattern, made it stronger, made it more automatic. Every time Lisa asked, how could I make this work? She reinforced creativity, problem solving, resourcefulness. After 5 years, David's brain was trained to see obstacles and stop. Lisa's brain was trained to see obstacles and start solving. This is what people mean when they talk about a wealthy mindset. It's not about thinking positive thoughts. It's not about affirmations or visualization. It's about asking different questions. Questions that keep your brain working. Questions that lead to action. Questions that create possibilities. The phrase, I can't afford that, isn't about money at all. It's about how you think, how you solve problems, how you engage with the world. And changing that one phrase, that one automatic response, can literally change your entire life. So let's bring this all together. The question gap, the scarcity shutdown, the passive victim trap, the value blindness, the learning block. These aren't personality flaws. These aren't about being good or bad with money. These are patterns, mental habits, automatic responses that can be changed once you become aware of them. The phrase, I can't afford that, is dangerous because it stops your brain. It ends the conversation. It closes the door. It keeps you stuck. But how could I afford that is powerful because it starts your brain. It begins the conversation. It opens doors. It creates movement. Here's what gives me so much hope about this. You don't need more money to change this pattern. You don't need a better job. You don't need luck or connections or advantages. You just need to catch yourself. When you feel that automatic I can't afford it rising up, pause, reframe, ask a better question. How could I afford this? What would it take? Is there a creative solution I'm not seeing? What's the real obstacle here? What could I learn from this limitation? At first, it'll feel awkward, unnatural. Your brain will want to default back to can't afford it because that's comfortable, that's familiar, that's what you've always done. But keep practicing, keep asking, keep staying curious instead of defeated, and something remarkable will happen. Your brain will start generating solutions, ideas, possibilities, paths forward that you couldn't see before, not because they weren't there, but because you weren't looking for them. Wealthy people aren't wealthy because they can afford everything. They're wealthy because they refuse to let "I can't afford it" be the end of the story. They ask better questions. They stay in problem-solving mode. They see financial challenges as puzzles, not dead ends. You can do this too. Starting right now with the very next thing you encounter that you want but don't currently have money for. Don't say, "I can't afford that." Say, "How could I afford that?" And see where your brain takes you. Because the question you ask determines the answer you get, and the answers you get determine the life you build. So, what's it going to be? Are you going to keep closing doors with "I can't afford it"? Or are you ready to start opening them with "How could I make this work?"